Well, I am so excited to have Jo Saxton with us today. Now, Jo is not only a great speaker, but she's the co-host of the podcast Lead Stories, which you really should tune into. She's also the author of many books, including titles like More Than Enchanting, Through the Barriers to Influence Your World, The Dream of You, and her latest book is Ready to Rise, which is a brilliant book looking at issues, real life issues that women face, and helping women move through disempowerment and together grow. Now, I first met Jo at St Thomas Crooks in Sheffield. Jo was in her 20s, you may remember Jo, and very impressive as a young woman, leading at a time at St Thomas when there was a lot of innovation and rapid growth going on. So not surprisingly, Jo is also a leadership coach. Now, Jo was born to Nigerian parents. She was raised in London, but now lives in Minneapolis with her husband and their 2 daughters. And this means that Jo brings a multicultural and international perspective to her leadership training. Now, I heard you recently talk about burnout, Jo, and that's really what I want to ask you to. But I want to start with a few questions around leadership, race, and gender. I've heard you ask a really interesting question to leaders. That is, who were you before anyone told you who you were supposed to be? And I want to ask a little bit about that for you. I want to ask you that question. But first of all, just tell me, what are you getting at when you ask that question?
Yeah, it's a question that I ask people a lot and leaders a lot, because what I've seen for many of us, for most of us, there is the sense of call that we have on our lives. And then life happens to you. It could be a relationship that defines you. We're defined by people's words or an experience, positive or negative, that can limit us or shape us in a particular way. And so we find that instead of leading out of our calling or purely out of our calling, we're leading out of the reactions to our call, the reactions to experiences. So what I'm getting at is asking people, what did God originally say? What was the original sense of calling, the original dream that God had given you? And are you living into that? Because I find it helps us get clear the rubble, as it were, so we can rebuild.
That's brilliant. I so relate to that. I certainly had my own issues with stepping into leadership and had to recognize that this was all related to just bad experiences in the past that had come to define me. But it's so important to ask that question. Now, Jo, you grew up in London in the 1970s, where there were a lot of racial tensions, and your own family experienced quite a lot of discrimination in the 1960s. And I guess, that could affect who you were as you grew up. Who were you before you became a leader? Tell me what it was like for you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was every decade. So it was the 60s when my family landed in the UK, in the 70s, for sure, in the 80s, in the 90s, all of them. Every decade, there would be definitive experiences, both in London and then when I moved to Sheffield as well, and when my husband and I got married. And so when, in terms of how definitive it was, I think there was often the sense of being other, that although I grew up in London and grew up in England, there was often the question, so where are you really from? As though you didn't actually belong here. And sometimes it was an innocent question, but it was always this reminder that you were someone else, and a sense of you not necessarily belonging, through to the use of the N-word, through to like strangers who would find it okay to shout on the tube, go back to your own country. And I'm like, we don't even know who each other are. And through to, if I was the first Black person someone had known or been in close relationship with, being asked really invasive questions about your body and how often you wash, to your hair, people touching you without consent, whether it was like just to see your skin or almost like you're an oddity. And if that person was a person in authority over you, so they might have been a teacher, they might have been a pastor or something, then as a child, as a teenager, you're like, how do you get to respond to this? Because that person has power in some way as well. When you're in I remember a situation when I got spat at in the street, when a guy basically cleared, I was in my 20s at this point, so this was in the 90s, and a guy shouted at me. He and his friend cleared his throat and then spat. And I remember thinking, this is a public place, it's a busy place, and no one even asks if I'm okay. And it was just the sheer vulnerability of it. And so I think when you have this layer upon layer upon layer of trauma, of experiences, it's hard to trust people. It's hard to know whether you're safe. When those experiences happen within the body of Christ as well, it's like you're not really sure where you belong. And yes, I felt called to lead, but I wondered whether it would be possible. Do you know, do you know what I mean? I wondered whether it would be possible, whether it would be tokenistic, because I was confident in the God I knew. I just wasn't very confident in the people around me.
Yeah. And I've heard you say that, you can get detached from your potential when you have those kind of experiences. Yeah. So how did that, how were you able to sort of progress? Because, not only did you have all those experiences, but then, you're a woman, you're a Black woman, and I met you as in your 20s when you started leading. But how did you get to lead when you had to, in a sense, you had to push through?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were probably two tracks happening at the same time. Well, two or three, one in my mind, one in practice, and then the Lord just trying to get in from time to time. I do remember, in terms of that sense of who do you think you are, being the line going through my head the whole time. Like you're too much. You're not enough. You're not like the people around you. Your stories, your experiences are different. What do you think you've got to offer these people when they're not even sure where you're from, or when depending on the stereotype that they'd encountered about Nigerians, about women and all these things. I think it was just like these intersections of pressure that I felt again and again and again. And I think the thing that helped me, there were often mentors, men and women. There was one particular mentor when I was about 18, 19, who was a Black woman. And I think it was so powerful to see somebody else doing it in the context I was in. There were remote examples. There were, but again, at that time, you didn't even see Black people often in a magazine. Do you know what I mean? Or on a TV show. And if it was imported from the States, which was wonderful, but it was distant, so painfully distant. And so to have somebody who just said yes to your calling, and to have leaders, men and women, white and Black, who would say, I see God doing something, was and to be welcomed, to have an experience of welcome, and for someone who would thrash out your ideas with you, or thrash out a sense of what's God doing, was huge because it was a yes to the thing that were going on in your own soul, in your own story. And it was, and it was more than a yes. It was a yes, we see God's doing something, but now we're not going to say, okay, go off and do something. We're going to come alongside you. We're going to invest in you, but invest in the you that you are, not the you that makes us comfortable. Invest in the way that you're wired, open doors where we can, all of those sorts of things. And I mean, it was very difficult. It was no utopia. And there were lots of tears. There was lots of loneliness. And I think every time I stepped out on a stage, I could see that there was maybe 2 other Black people in the room. Every time I stepped into, as a woman, when you are leading and speaking and you're the only woman in a room, there's a vulnerability there. Yeah. There's a vulnerability, and you don't want to overcompensate. And there's also that thing that you feel of, God, don't let me be the last. Do you know what I mean? Don't let me be the one who shuts the door for every other woman, for every other Black woman coming through, for every other young person coming through. Don't let me mess this up. Yeah. And it's the kind of accountability that actually is a burden. Is actually because it makes it harder to enjoy. It took me a long time to realize that calling was something I could delight in with the Lord. And enjoy and receive as a gift. Do you know what I mean? Rather than a task. Because of the pressure that I felt at the time.
Yeah. And, how much do you think also behind all of that was your trust in the Lord and the what He has said to you about who you are? There's like what people think, and having to stand constantly with that pressure, that burden. And then it's your journey with the Lord.
Yeah, I think that's probably what made it so conflicting, because I think if I was left with just the pressure, I'd have walked away and done something else for sure. I thought there were easier ways to live. than this. And I'm sure many of us as leaders think, if we were doing it just because of us, we would have found another job by now, which was just less demanding in so many ways. But I think I could not get away. It says, doesn't it? The gift and call of God is irrevocable. I could not get away from his goodness. I couldn't get away from the vision of the kingdom of God changing things in the world. I could not get away from the belief that I expected the world to be broken.
Yeah.
I mean, I expected the world to be broken. I expected that Jesus was the change agent for society and that his values were different. And I'm made in his image. I'm made in his image. And so and so it was this constant, what am I going to believe? Am I going to believe what the racial realities are saying to me, the gender realities are saying to me, or am I going to believe what the Lord is saying to me and walk on that? And to be honest, it was a battle, sometimes in the same hour.
Oh, that's brilliant. But that's such a good thing, what you're saying there, Jo, because I can see that applying to so many people who see all kinds of obstacles and burdens that they're carrying, reasons why they can't step into their calling, and yet, coming into agreement with what God says, and that being kind of the stronger. If you're having two rows, one with people and the other with God, God's going to win if you pay attention to him. Now, Jo, I'm white, I'm middle class. John and I are leading a predominantly white church. We do have some quite a growing group of people from diverse backgrounds. And since the death of Lord Floyd, we were really impacted, but we kind of quite quickly shifted from what's going on in the US to actually what about here in the UK. And as soon as we started looking into it, as soon as we started picking up the phone, talking to our Black brothers and sisters in the church, people from different ethnicities, not just Black, but, brown people and people from Asia and China and places who are in our church. And we just started asking them what their experience has been, and our eyes were opened. And we started to become aware of things like white privilege. I'd never thought of it. Or that sometimes you can say a racist thing. You don't think you're racist, but you can say something. There's a spectrum of racism. And, you might say, I'm not a racist, but somewhere, you with blindness, we're saying things. What advice would you give to those of us as leaders who want to embrace diversity in our church and empower everybody, whatever their skin color, to be able to flourish? What are some things that you would advise us? What journey should we go on?
I would say the first thing I would say to everybody is it's going to be a long journey. If you are wanting to kind of make things look right, even out for sometimes we can do the wrong things with the right reasons. If we're looking for a quick fix, a silver bullet, a panacea, this is not the journey you want to go on. This is a humbling journey for you, because the thing is, though you may be aware of this now, we've been aware for years. I was aware of racial inequity when someone first called me a name at the age of 3 years old. So where you have, and I'm 46 now, so when you have encountered something and are like, okay, my eyes have been opened, one of your challenges is your eyes have been opened, but now you have to reckon with the fact that your brothers and sisters have been suffering, have been spat at, have been abused, have not got jobs, have not had opportunities for decades, and they are living with the grief. So when you and are living in the realities of that, so when you turn and speak to them, their first response has been, about time. Where have you been? Because there aren't any participation awards for this. I remember I live in Minneapolis. So when George Floyd was murdered, obviously there's a thing in the context of our family. But I remember feeling this surge of anger when I watched things happen in the UK. And I was like, Lord, what is wrong with me? And I realized, I thought because there were a couple of things that happened. One, my mum and I had a conversation, and she said to me, my mum still lives in London, and she says, hey, where are you in relation to George Floyd and all the racial uprisings happening? And I said, oh, Mum, I'm about half an hour away in the car. It's not like when we lived near Brixton. And I just thought, here we are, and there are 40 years difference, and us talking about the same inequities, the same thing about police brutality, that it's just then we lived 3 miles from it, and now I'm 15 miles from it. And so that's the legacy of the world in which we're in. Yeah. That's the reality. So, and I'm not saying that I know this doesn't make anybody feel better, but facts. There are, and it may have been more pronounced in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but not always. And so I think that's the first thing I want to say to everybody. This is a long one. It's a tender one. It's a raw one. The different generations in your church may respond differently. How my mum, as an 80-year-old woman, deals with it is very different to how I deal with it. It's very different to how my daughters, who are biracial, deal with it. And so and that may leave you feeling real vulnerable because you're like, I'm not quite sure what to feel or quite sure what to say or what language to use. It requires incredible humility on our parts to listen and just think, oh, am I a terrible person because I'm white? Do you know what I mean? Am I a terrible person because I'm privileged? And it may bring up all the defensiveness of, but because things like privilege, people will be like, well, I had a real rough life. And then it's hard to remember that privilege isn't about, it's not the kind of suffering Olympics. It's about the things we never had to go through. And more. And so this is a tough one for us as leaders. And I think we do really need to lean into the Spirit of God. We do really need to ask ourselves again, God, show me, drop the scales from my eyes as a daily spiritual practice, which means that it may feel like a valley before you reach a mountaintop. And then alongside that, then it's considering what you're reading. It's considering who you're listening to. It's considering, the lived experience of others and what does that mean for them, and asking them. And again, there's a difference between diversity and inclusion and equity. So diversity is like, you may have a sprinkling of people of color in your congregation. That does not mean it's that people are invited to the table.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And because the other thing with race is power. Power has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
So deep breath, friends. And if there was a time to get your prayer and fasting on, this is the moment.
Yeah.
Because it is hard and we will make mistakes. We will make mistakes.
And I think that's what we're realizing, Jo. We're in this for the long haul. This has to be made right, and it has to be in the church. And there's a lot of repentance. There's a lot of even recently, I made a mistake. I said something. I didn't mean it, but when I said it, it came from a wrong belief. And thankfully, the person talked to me about it, and I was able to, honestly, I was devastated, but it was so helpful because it led to actually a greater level of intimacy. And, we kind of went to another level where I felt I could ask even questions and know, I may make mistakes here, that I don't want to hurt you, but I need to know this and that. And so we realized it is a long journey. And Jo, I could talk about this for hours, but I also want to talk about the subject of burnout, because obviously we are in really hard times, and whoever we are, whatever we do, we could have a burnout experience. Now, you had a real burnout experience, significant, a few years ago. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we were campus pastors at a church about 7-8 years ago, and it was wonderful. It was actually a really wonderful experience until it wasn't. I think I don't know how to put it any other way than that, really. It was great and loved it, but the church was, unbeknownst to a number of us, there were a number of things going on behind closed doors, to the point where 12 of us, including the senior pastor, just all felt we needed to step down on the same day. But in the midst of all of that, as the kind of meltdowns took place, oh my gosh, it's almost like all the old stories began to kick in. All the old stories, because a number of things started happening. One of the interesting things that started, not pleasant, but interesting things started happening, is that when there was gossip being said, and a lot was said to me about my ethnicity. It was the first time it had ever been mentioned in this church. And like, where's she really from? Or suddenly all the old, and it's like, oh, okay. So it's fascinating that when you're under pressure, what comes out, and what came out under pressure was a number of racist things that were said about me and my family. So that was the one thing. So there's a story going on, and what that often triggers in me is when we were growing up as immigrants in the UK, it was the mantra was, look, for you to get anywhere, for you to get a job, to be treated as equal, you will have to be at least twice as good as everybody else. Wow. So that even if they don't like you because you're black, even if they don't respect you because you're a woman, you'll still get the job because you are way above and beyond what everybody else is. And I remember my aunt sitting with me, I was about 7 years old when we had that conversation for the first time. And a number of my friends have had the same, of a number of ethnicities. And I know a number of women have had their similar stories they've thought about themselves professionally as well. Mm. we're given that advice to survive, not because we're saying we're better or we're saying someone else is the enemy. It is more, how are you going to pay bills? The kind of thing. This is the pathway. And so for me at that time, I'm like, I don't know how to be twice as good in this instance. Do you know what I mean? I've been doing this all my life and trying to be faithful. And yes, you're trying to be faithful for the Lord and all these other things, but these are the tracks going, you're kind of coming up against racism. You're coming up against all these things. Meanwhile, there are a number of young adults who we're investing in, and they are all over the place because of what's happening. So you want to be there for people. So that means your days are longer. And so so you can see the perfect storm brewing, can't you? The external pressures, the racism and the lies being said about you, the feeling that you've got to be twice as good. Your kids are going to school and you're wanting to keep life normal and just keep on going. You'll rest later. Late night phone call with somebody in tears. Keep on going. Terrible email where somebody says something abusive to you. Keep on going. And late night thing where people are panicking, stressing, money pressures, because both my husband and I worked for the same church at that point. And money pressures. What does this mean about bills? Will we get to see family this year because everybody's in the UK? And it's like, and it just builds. And so one of those things you feel you can handle, and you don't realizing you're handling 10 of those things.
Yeah. And Jo, what happened? You ended up all this pressure, internal and external, and this belief that you have to work twice as hard. And I can see a number of people will relate to that sort of belief. Of, I've got to perform, I've got to do better, and things getting worse and worse. Where did you end up? What happened to you? How did you know you were in burnout?
I think I realized I was burnt out when we left the church and it was quieter and peaceful and all of these things. But I couldn't sleep. And so I'd stay up late because I would start having panic attacks in my sleep and anxiety attacks in my sleep. And what would happen is I'd wake up and I'd start grabbing at my throat. And I know there's a whole spiritual continuum what we can feel is happening, but I've had panic. I knew it was a panic attack on this one. And I couldn't breathe. And I was like, and I remember saying to the Lord, can you make this stop? Can you make this stop, Lord? I just need you to make this stop. And I'd stay up later and later and later. So I'd have, and the panic attacks increased 3 or 4 times a night. Wow. And so, and then obviously the next morning and breakfast is on the table and you send your kids to school and do you know what I mean? And you begin again. And to the point where I think it was 6 months after about 6 months of this, I woke up and I was having heart palpitations and I had to go to the emergency room. And I was, and it was at that point when the doctor was asking, he said, your heart's fine, but what's going on? And when he said, do you sleep? And I said, yeah, I slept in February. And he said, Mrs. Saxton, it's October. And that was the moment where it's like, okay, you cannot pretend anymore. So,
gosh. Wow. And what do you think were some of the underlying factors? I mean, you've talked about patterns of thinking. You've talked about, you're running so fast trying to resolve what's going on. Were there some sort of other underlying things, do you think, going on for you?
I think it was I think it was the helplessness of it all, because here's the other challenging thing about some of these, you've got to be twice as hard, twice as good and all of that kind of stuff. There's the easy way I could say this is to say, what we need to know is that Jesus loves us as we are and we don't have to be that. Here's the problem though. My last racist response in my profession, and I'm a Christian speaker, was this year. So it's still happening. It's still happening where event organizers are being said, we don't want this Black woman speaking. That was an event I did in February. So it's not like it's gone.
No.
I mean, it's not like it's gone anywhere. And so, and for those of us who are, as women, as we're like, we know it's not gone. And so I think that was probably one of this kind of, Lord, I'm wrestling with this because the challenges are still here. And I don't want to, I don't know what else to do. It's worked for me before. So I think that was part of it. I think some of it was just the loss and the grief and the pain. We'd seen some wonderful things happen in that community. we were seeing some amazing breakthroughs. And so you sometimes want to hang on because it's like, will it all be lost? And you forget that you're not responsible, that you're not the King of Kings, and that he will take care of it. But you know, when you've done this enough times, you know the devastation this causes. I know people years on who are still like, I can't go to church again.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Those are the things.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jo, if somebody's like experiencing, you know, they're not sleeping or they're realizing they are, I've recognized, gosh, that sounds like me. What are some of the signs that you would say that you need to take notice? So this is more than just a short little stressful thing.
There are a couple of things I would say. I would ask, are you sleeping? Literally, are you sleeping well? Are you eating well? Are you drinking well? I think sometimes and particularly those of us who are in the more charismatic streams can forget the significance of your physical body. Do you know what I mean? We can bind and loose till the cows come home, and yet we still don't sleep. And we haven't asked ourselves a question about whether we're sleeping. So that would be one. When people ask you how you're doing and you say you're fine, because it's easier to say that than say what's actually going on, alarm bell. When you're just, I'm just going to get to here, when your rest is always on the other side of a desperate mountaintop, that's an alarm to you. When people tell you they're worried about you or they're concerned, listen to them. When sometimes you need a friend because you don't see it yourself. Yeah. You don't see, when people are like, this feels like it's a little bit much, or you don't need to do that as well. But for you, you're like, I've just got to keep on going. And when we find like we're holding on so tightly because the busyness and the activity and the facing it or dealing with it or barreling through it feels safer than the unknown, alarm. Yeah.
Wow, that's really helpful. I've heard you say you have one body and your leadership lives in it. And obviously there are people watching here who might not be leaders, but, you know, you have one body and your motherhood lives on it or your career lives in it. Tell me a bit about that. That's it was an inspiring phrase.
Yeah, I think it was probably one of my takeaways from that moment, that year, because after that year, after I got to the doctors, and there were a number of things that happened. The doctor gave me anti-anxiety meds. I went to counseling for a long time. I kind of built up my prayer support and everything. I had people like ministering. It was like people washing your feet on a rate. Just praying for the Spirit to do his work, surrounding us as a family and all of that kind of, you know. So we had this kind of multidisciplinary response. Mm-hmm. But I think I realized, you know, God he places a call in our lives. He gives us this opportunity. When your body is out, you're out. You're out. Yeah. You know, so if I can't get up that day, and I'm not saying, you know, if you are not now, let me qualify this. There are those of us who are leading in the midst of chronic illness. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, are we taking care with whatever our life is? I'm not saying we're limited and therefore we can't serve the Lord, because that would assume our brothers and sisters with different disabilities, who are slaying in the name of Jesus, aren't doing it. And they are. What I'm saying to us, though, is if you are not taking care of what God has given you and the life you have. Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And it's so important. We've been talking in the last few years a lot about rest and, you know, just getting away and resting. But also, I love the fact that you talked about people asking you questions or telling you, you know, you're not doing well, Jo, what's going on? And how, you know, and I've heard you say before about needing your people, the importance of leading in community. And, you know, tell me a little bit about why you're so passionate about community and. There are two sets of reasons why I'm really passionate about it. One of them is, and I think all of us would recognize this, when we hear the stories of a leader who has, to coin a phrase, fallen from grace or who's had deep crisis, you hear there's often a familiar refrain. I was empty. I was at the end of myself. I was lonely. So many leaders are incredibly lonely. And I get it, because when we are leading worship or when we are speaking, or sometimes the dynamic is such that we're not connected in our communities as deeply as we feel able as we'd like, or we've just got used to kind of going off the stage and being on our own. But actually we really, really need people who will ask us difficult questions. And I say that to us, whether we are leading in churches, leading in business, entrepreneurs, in the context of our home or community. Who do you have who is willing to ask you difficult, vulnerable things, who doesn't think just because you're awesome, they have no questions to ask? The truth is you are awesome. It's just you're also human. So we are tested and tempted like anybody else.
Oh, gosh, that's so true. No, you carry on, Jo. That's so true.
Yeah, I think the other piece is why we really need our people. To be honest, is drawn from when I remember. One of the things I remember growing up with my mum and my aunts is on Sunday nights they used to braid my hair. It was very painful, but you'd have these women who would sit and cook, and but they would talk to each other, and they'd tell you where to get the best meat, and they'd tell you where. They process difficult situations, relationships, racism, kids, and as a community, they made their way in the world. And I think what I've learned from, even as I remember it, is the other reason why we need each other is because we will bring out each other's gifts. We will mentor each other. We will call out what God is doing. We will speak life over each other. But we can't do that when we're not in close enough proximity. And rather than compete, we could be collaborating, we could be commissioning one another, we could be rising strong together and being launched into the world for the purposes of God. And I think for both of those reasons, that's why it's hugely important that we have good, strong, vibrant relationships with people.
Jo, there's so many jewels there, just so many things that we get to take home from that, especially, leading in community where not only you're accountable and people can ask you difficult questions, but also it's people that help draw out your gifts and where you can really grow. And Jo, it's been a delight to interview you and to see you flourishing at this time in your life, married with two little girls. And so thank you for being with us for this Vineyard National Gathering. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much.